Deep in the Pacific Northwest, the archival police ledger for Oakhaven County contains a gap spanning 3 decades where missing persons reports were filed, sealed, and fundamentally erased from public record. This is a quiet town enveloped by immense ancient pines, where the trees seem to whisper secrets that the locals refuse to speak aloud. The silence here is not the peaceful quiet of nature, but the heavy, suffocating hush of a community holding its breath. Beneath the facade of quaint storefronts and neighborly waves, an anomalous undercurrent of dread dictates daily life. The residents navigate their streets with a subtle vigilance, acutely aware of the dark history buried beneath their feet. They know that in Oakhaven, the fog rolling in from the mountains does not just obscure the landscape, it masks the truth of those who walked into the mist and never returned. The first documented anomaly in this unsettling pattern materialized in the autumn of 1958 with the sudden absence of David Miller. He was a young mechanic with grease permanently stained into his hands and vocal dreams of traversing the country, far away from the isolated borders of his hometown. One evening he clocked out of the local garage, left his prized leather jacket draped over a chair, and simply ceased to exist within the town's reality. There were no signs of struggle, no frantic farewells, and no trace of his vehicle on the winding mountain roads. When the initial search parties returned with empty hands, the local authorities quickly filed the paperwork away with a single, chilling designation. The official record labeled his vanishing as entirely unexplained, a bureaucratic dismissal that would soon become a terrifying standard for Oakhaven. The immediate aftermath of David's disappearance left a permanent, minuscule fracture in the town's collective sense of security. A palpable fear began to creep into the living rooms and diners of Oakhaven, replacing casual gossip with hushed, anxious speculations. It was not merely the tragedy of one missing young man, but the dawn of a disturbing realization that the ground beneath their feet was no longer safe. Neighbors who had shared fences for generations suddenly began looking at each other with subtle suspicion, wondering what secrets were being kept behind drawn curtains. Parents tightened their grips on their children's hands during evening walks, and the once bustling town square emptied out long before the sun dipped below the tree line. The psychological toll was immense as the community grappled with an invisible threat that exerted force upon their daily routines without ever showing its face. The fear was not of an outsider, but of the encroaching darkness that seemed to belong to the town itself. This growing unease fundamentally altered the social fabric, turning Oakhaven into a town of locked doors and lowered voices. The terrifying reality of their situation was confirmed in 1965 when the shadows swallowed a second life. Emily Stone was a beloved schoolteacher, deeply woven into the fabric of the community, known for her bright demeanor and her unwavering dedication to the town's children. She vanished on a Tuesday morning, leaving a half-drank cup of coffee on her kitchen counter and her lesson plans neatly laid out on her desk. Her disappearance struck at the very heart of Oakhaven, proving that neither innocence nor deep roots offered protection from whatever lurked in the periphery. Once again, the local investigations yielded no physical evidence, no witnesses, and no logical trajectory for her departure. The authorities applied the exact same procedural stamp to her file, cementing her fate under the hauntingly familiar label of an unexplained event. The identical classification of Emily's case established a grim, bureaucratic precedent that practically guaranteed no further resources would be allocated to finding her. In the wake of these twin tragedies, a counterintuitive reaction took hold of the townspeople. Instead of rising up to demand answers from their leaders or launching relentless independent searches, Oakhaven folded inward. A rigid code of silence emerged, an unspoken agreement that asking questions only invited the darkness closer to your own doorstep. This subtle pressure to conform and look the other way became a survival mechanism, passed down through quiet warnings and disapproving glances. Residents essentially learned to accept the vanishings as a grim tax levied by the surrounding wilderness, a fatalistic mindset that paralyzed any pursuit of justice. To speak of David or Emily was to break the town's fragile illusion of normalcy, so their names were slowly erased from public conversation. This willful ignorance allowed the true mechanics of the disappearances to remain entirely obscured from outside scrutiny. The chilling effectiveness of this silence was proven 14 years later in the bitter winter of 1979 with the vanishing of Mark Peterson. Mark was a local hardware store owner, a man whose entire life was anchored to the predictable rhythms of Main Street. His disappearance, separated from Emily's by over a decade, but bound by the exact same lack of evidence and suddenness, shattered any remaining belief in coincidence. This third case definitively cemented the idea of a deliberate, ongoing pattern operating just beneath the surface of the town. The intervals between the events were long enough to lull the community into a false sense of security, only to strike again with calculated precision. Mark's empty storefront stood as a gargantuan monument to the town's failure to protect its own, a silent scream that no one dared to acknowledge. The dust gathering on the counters of Mark's abandoned shop served as a constant physical reminder of the void left behind. The human cost of these unanswered questions began to rot the community from the inside out, leaving families trapped in a perpetual state of agonizing purgatory. The families left behind in Oakhaven did not just lose their children, siblings, and spouses. They lost the basic human right to grieve. Without a body, without a crime scene, and without a single concrete answer, their sorrow became an open wound that could never heal. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar car driving down the gravel roads, sparked a cruel, fleeting hope that was inevitably crushed. The lack of closure twisted their memories into a constant, agonizing loop of what-ifs, leaving them trapped in a purgatory of waiting for someone who was never coming home. That heavy, suffocating grief eventually seeped into the very soil of the town, turning the quiet streets into a sprawling monument to the missing. To understand how so many people could simply vanish without a trace, you have to understand the geography that kept Oakhaven completely cut off from the rest of the world. Nestled deep within the rugged interior of the Pacific Northwest, the town was surrounded by millions of acres of dense, unforgiving timberland and treacherous mountain passes. There was only one paved road in, and that same road was the only way out, making it remarkably easy to monitor who came and went. This extreme isolation bred a culture that was inherently suspicious of outsiders and fiercely protective of its own internal affairs. The towering Douglas firs and endless stretches of shadow provided the perfect natural cover for a community that preferred to handle its problems without the interference of state police or federal authorities. It was an environment that essentially swallowed people whole, offering thousands of places where a secret could be buried and never found. But the wilderness alone could not account for the sheer number of empty bedrooms and abandoned cars, pointing instead to something far more deliberate hiding within the tree line. Behind closed doors and drawn curtains, the remaining residents began to whisper about a controlling force operating within the town limits. These were not the frantic rumors of paranoid citizens, but quiet, terrifying conclusions drawn from decades of observing who held the real power in Oakhaven. A specific faction, perhaps an old, foundational family with deep ties to the local logging industry, seemed to dictate the silent rules of the community. They controlled the local employment, the property lines, and, most importantly, the flow of information that reached the county sheriff. When someone crossed this unseen authority or threatened to expose the rot beneath the town's quiet surface, they did not receive a warning. They simply ceased to exist, erased from the town ledger as if they had never walked those streets at all. Living under the shadow of that nameless, faceless power stripped the community of its trust, turning neighbors into potential informants. As the list of the missing grew, a chilling pattern began to emerge among the names pinned to the sheriff's bulletin board. The individuals who vanished were rarely the compliant, quiet residents who kept their heads down and followed the unwritten laws of Oakhaven. Instead, the victims shared a dangerous commonality. They were the restless ones, the people who had loudly expressed a desire to pack up and leave the valley for good. Whether it was a teenager saving money for a bus ticket out of state, or a mill worker threatening to take a dispute to the regional labor board, a desire to break the boundary lines was treated as an unforgivable offense. The town operated on a strict binary of loyalty, where you were either entirely committed to staying and keeping the secrets, or you were deemed a threat to the fragile ecosystem. Leaving on your own terms was simply not an option that the controlling forces would allow. The realization that ambition, or a desire for freedom, was essentially a death sentence broke the spirit of the younger generation. For those who remained, daily life in Oakhaven devolved into a masterclass in psychological survival. A constant, low-level anxiety hummed beneath every interaction at the grocery store and every casual conversation at the diner. Residents learned to meticulously police their own words and actions, terrified that a misplaced complaint or a lingering glance might put their own name on the list of the departed. The true horror was not just the fear of being next, but the crushing burden of suspecting exactly who was responsible and knowing you could do absolutely nothing about it. Fathers sat in the same pews as the men they believed took their sons, exchanging polite nods while swallowing their rage to protect their surviving children. It was a community held hostage by its own survival instincts, forced to participate in a collective delusion of normalcy. That forced compliance ensured the local police blotter remained suspiciously pristine, showing only minor traffic violations and noise complaints. When families did muster the courage to demand an official investigation, the response from local authorities was maddeningly dismissive. Missing persons reports were routinely filed away with the immediate assumption that the individual had simply chosen to walk away and start a new life elsewhere. In a landscape dominated by steep ravines and fast-moving rivers, it was all too convenient for a deputy to shrug and suggest the victim had fallen prey to a hiking accident or a drunken misstep. The county investigators rarely pushed past the initial interviews, accepting the town's collective silence as proof that nothing nefarious had occurred. For the desperate parents and spouses, begging for a search party felt like screaming into a void. They watched helplessly as the critical first 48 hours ticked by without a single tracking dog being deployed or a single search warrant being signed. The systemic failure of the justice system effectively granted the perpetrators a permanent, localized immunity. Ultimately, the enduring mystery of Oakhaven tapped into a primal, ancient fear that humanity has never quite managed to shake. It is the terrifying realization that just beyond the glow of our porch lights, the vast, untamed wilderness still holds the power to consume us without a trace. The deep forests of the Pacific Northwest became a canvas for this profound dread, a place where the laws of modern society simply stopped functioning at the tree line. The disappearances in Oakhaven tapped into something far older than the town itself, a primal anxiety rooted in the vast, untamed expanse of the Pacific Northwest. Beyond the safety of the streetlights, the dense timberline stood as a constant reminder of how easily a person could be swallowed by the wild, triggering an ancient human terror of the unknown. The wilderness was not just a backdrop, but an active participant in the town's unfolding nightmare. A place where the rules of civilization simply ceased to exist, a raw, primal stage for the unknown. That relentless tree line loomed over every backyard, an ever-present boundary between the known world and the terrifying void, a silent sentinel of what lay beyond the familiar. The weight of these unresolved fates did not dissipate with time, but instead settled heavily across the decades, casting a long, suffocating shadow over multiple generations. Children born years after the initial vanishings, like the mysterious case of David Miller in 1958, grew up inheriting a profound, unspoken caution, learning early on that certain names, like Emily Stone from 1965, were never to be mentioned, and certain paths into the woods were never to be walked, particularly those near the old Peterson farmstead where Mark vanished in 1979. This inherited trauma transformed the community, turning the fear of speaking out, or even the simple desire to leave Oakhaven, into a paralyzing force, a collective psychological paralysis. Families passed down hushed stories as survival mechanisms, creating a culture where silence was equated with safety and curiosity, especially about the unusual lights reported over Blackwood Ridge in the late 1980s, was viewed as a dangerous, potentially fatal flaw. Each suppressed conversation cemented a local code of conduct, effectively turning the townspeople into wardens of their own silent prison, each resident a guard in their own gilded cage of fear. Yet amid this pervasive dread, the residents who chose to remain in Oakhaven forged a quiet, determined existence, a testament to their stubborn will. They built a fragile normalcy, opening their diners like the Oakhaven Cafe, attending Sunday services at St. Jude's, and celebrating high school football victories with the Oakhaven Owls, all while consciously ignoring the empty seats at the dinner table and the lingering absences in their community photos. Their everyday routines became acts of quiet defiance against the darkness that had claimed so many of their own, a deliberate march against the encroaching shadows. This resilience was born of necessity, a collective agreement to keep moving forward because acknowledging the full scope of the terror would have meant admitting that their home, the place they loved, was fundamentally unsafe, a truth too devastating to bear. This stubborn commitment to ordinary life masked a profound exhaustion, the heavy toll of pretending everything was fine when nothing ever was, a weary performance for a captive audience. Decades later, the passage of time finally allowed a new generation of investigators, including retired FBI agent Sarah Jenkins and local historian Dr. Alan Croft, to re-examine the core tragedies of David Miller in 1958, Emily Stone in 1965, and Mark Peterson in 1979 with fresh, unburdened eyes. Stripped of the immediate panic and the local politics of the era, which saw early investigations hampered by the town council's insistence on simple explanations, the old case files began to reveal subtle anomalies that had previously been overlooked or deliberately ignored by overwhelmed county sheriffs. Modern forensic analysis, including advanced DNA tracing and satellite imagery review, and a shifting cultural willingness to question authority, particularly the official narratives presented by the Oakhaven Sheriff's Department in the 1970s and 80s, brought new perspectives to these cold cases, illuminating connections that the original detectives, bound by limited resources and local pressure, had missed. What once appeared to be isolated, tragic accidents or simple runaways now began to look like a deliberate, orchestrated pattern of extraction, a chilling conclusion supported by the recurring presence of an unidentified dark sedan in witness statements. The dusty archives, once viewed as dead ends by the original investigators, suddenly became active maps to buried truths, each yellowed document a potential breadcrumb leading out of the wilderness of speculation. The enduring power of these unexplained vanishings lies in their absolute lack of resolution, a void that actively commands the human imagination, a canvas for our deepest fears. Without a body, a confession, or a clear motive, the mind is left to construct its own terrifying scenarios, filling the gaps with our most deep-seated fears of being lost, forgotten, or taken. This absence of closure ensures that the stories of Oakhaven never truly settle into the past, remaining instead as open wounds that continue to captivate and disturb outsiders and locals alike, a perpetual mystery broadcast on the winds. The mystery itself has become a living entity, feeding on the perpetual uncertainty and the desperate, lingering hope that answers might still be found, perhaps in the hushed whispers of the oldest residents. Every unresolved timeline and missing piece of evidence acts as an anchor, preventing the community from ever moving on, from truly healing the scars left by the past. The geography of the Pacific Northwest plays a crucial, complicating role in this enduring enigma, offering an environment uniquely suited to concealing secrets. The region is defined by its immense, rugged terrain, where dense, ancient forests, some dating back over 1,000 years, create an impenetrable canopy that blocks out the sun and confounds aerial searches, a natural cloak of invisibility. Navigating this landscape means contending with unpredictable weather, treacherous ravines that can swallow a vehicle whole, and an isolation so profound that a person could disappear just 50 yards from a main road like Highway 101. And never be seen again. The wilderness here does not merely hide evidence, it actively consumes it, breaking down traces of human existence with a rapid, indifferent efficiency, aided by the region's high rainfall and dense undergrowth. The land itself operates as a perfect accomplice, swallowing truth beneath layers of moss and shadow, a silent partner in Oakhaven's long-held secrets. For the residents of Oakhaven, this physical isolation mirrored a deep internal conflict, trapping those who harbored suspicions within a suffocating, self-imposed isolation, a psychological echo of their surroundings, the immense psychological pressure of carrying a piece of the puzzle, a strange vehicle seen on a logging road near the Olympic National Forest boundary, A muffled argument in the dead of night near the old cannery was compounded by the terrifying certainty that speaking up would make them the next target of the town's unspoken wrath, a threat as palpable as the ever-present fog. The air in Oakhaven was thick with an unspoken agreement, a suffocating code of silence that pressed down heavily on every single resident from the mill workers to the shop owners. People walked the familiar stretches of Main Street and Miller Avenue with their heads down and their eyes averted, carrying the immense psychological pressure of knowing, or at least deeply suspecting, the dark and violent truths deliberately hidden behind the locked doors of their neighbors. This collective refusal to speak effectively paralyzed any outside investigations from the moment state troopers first arrived at the county line. When external detectives tried to interview locals or examine the surrounding timberlands, they were met with blank stares, conveniently forgotten timelines, and locked gates, ensuring that the town's darkest secrets remained securely buried beneath layers of deliberate community obstruction. To truly comprehend the horror gripping Oakhaven, one must understand exactly what makes these particular disappearances fundamentally unexplained. It was never just a simple matter of someone packing a canvas duffel bag, draining a bank account, and quietly leaving town on the midnight bus. Instead, it was the absolute absence of credible evidence, the terrifying way people seemed to evaporate from their kitchens and driveways without a single muddy footprint, a dropped set of keys, or any logical motive to flee. The official explanations offered by the local sheriff's department, which usually blamed sudden animal attacks or disoriented hikers getting lost in the deep ravines, always fell apart under the slightest scientific scrutiny. The lack of torn clothing or recovered remains left a massive investigative void, a terrifying blank space that was quickly filled by a chilling, undeniable pattern of sudden, absolute erasure that defied all standard criminal profiling. Without concrete answers or physical evidence to bury, the grieving families were left to drown in a relentless, agonizing dread. They kept their porch lights burning through the darkest winter nights and sat rigidly by their telephones, forever waiting for a resolution or a ransom demand that would never arrive, trapped in a perpetual state of mourning where closure was entirely impossible to achieve. Over the passing decades, this unbroken chain of catastrophic loss fundamentally altered the core identity of Oakhaven. It ceased to be merely a hard-working, prosperous logging community known for its massive timber output and bustling weekend markets. Instead, it slowly transformed into a cursed geography, a place defined entirely by the people it had swallowed whole, becoming a cautionary tale whispered by residents in neighboring counties. The dense, towering pine forests and the deceptively quiet Main Street no longer represented a peaceful, idyllic rural life for the working class. They became a sprawling, grim monument to the missing, casting a long, inescapable shadow over every new generation born into the town, teaching children from a very young age to fear the very woods that sustained their local economy. Living day after day in a place famous only for its unresolved ghosts meant that every single resident eventually had to look over their own shoulder. The paranoia seeped into the mundane routines of daily existence, forcing people to double-check their deadbolts at dusk, install heavy iron bars on their ground-floor windows, and view every passing stranger or unfamiliar vehicle with intense, unyielding suspicion. The dread was heavily anchored to very specific years, marking distinct eras of tragedy that the town could never manage to shake. The nightmare began with the sudden loss of mill worker David Miller in 1958, escalated violently when young Emily Stone vanished from her own fenced backyard in 1965, and struck a devastating, undeniable blow with the disappearance of local mechanic Mark Peterson straight from the county highway in 1979. These catastrophic events were not clustered together in a single chaotic week of violence, but were methodically and chillingly spread across several decades. This slow, deliberate pacing created an inescapable, blood-soaked timeline that local authorities continually failed to connect, treating each vanishing as an isolated anomaly rather than recognizing the terrifying long-term predator operating right under their noses. The long, quiet decades separating these high-profile cases only served to deepen the overarching mystery, proving to the terrified locals that whatever was taking the people of Oakhaven was incredibly patient, frighteningly enduring, and deeply rooted in the bedrock of the community. It was a generational threat, capable of waiting in the shadows for years before striking out to claim its next carefully chosen victim. For the few observant citizens who finally realized the undeniable pattern, Oakhaven quickly transformed from a comforting home into a sprawling, invisible cage. The profound sense of being trapped was absolute and suffocating. If you suspected the dark truth, or simply desired to pack up and build a life beyond the town limits, the paralyzing fear of becoming the very next name added to the missing persons list kept you firmly and silently in place. It was a paralyzing, deeply personal terror that infected every social interaction, forcing residents to smile warmly at neighbors they no longer trusted and attend community barbecues while hiding their mounting panic. People were forced to sleep in homes that suddenly felt incredibly vulnerable, acutely aware that the thin wooden walls and locked doors offered absolutely no real protection against a threat that could strike without warning. This severe psychological imprisonment was heavily reinforced by the harsh economic realities of the isolated region, ensuring that simply packing up a moving truck and leaving was almost financially impossible for the average family. Most residents were tied down by underwater mortgages, heavy debts owed to the company store, and a complete lack of marketable skills outside the highly specialized, brutal labor required by the local timber trade. The absolute cornerstone of that local economy, the booming logging industry led by the Blackwood Timber Corporation, played a crucial, active role in maintaining the town's fiercely isolated and secretive nature. The grueling, insular work out in the harsh elements bred a fierce culture of extreme self-reliance and a deep, aggressive mistrust of outsiders, creating a perfect, impenetrable environment for keeping dangerous, bloody secrets hidden from the rest of the world. The massive, sprawling logging camps, situated deep in the old-growth woods, operated much like separate, completely lawless territories far beyond the reach of county sheriffs. These remote camps offered endless miles of rugged, unmapped terrain, abandoned equipment sheds, and deep ravines where physical evidence could be easily concealed, bodies could be buried under tons of sawdust, and dangerous questions were simply never asked by the exhausted foreman. The rigid, unforgiving hierarchy of the major timber companies demanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty from every single man on the payroll. This corporate structure effectively silenced any terrified worker who might have accidentally stumbled upon a shallow grave or a bloody piece of clothing they were not supposed to see, enforcing the town's silence through the very real threat of instant termination and immediate financial ruin. Yet even against the crushing, suffocating weight of the town's generational silence and the immense, unchecked power of the local logging industry, a few isolated voices eventually found the desperate courage to ask the dangerous questions. These brave few decided that uncovering the truth behind the vanishing citizens of Oakhaven was finally worth risking their livelihoods, their reputations, and potentially their very lives to break the curse. To push back against the prevailing silence required a quiet, terrifying kind of defiance. A handful of residents refused to accept the sudden absences of their neighbors, asking the local sheriff inconvenient questions or pressing the mill foreman for details that no one wanted to provide. These individuals found themselves rapidly isolated, their inquiries met with hardened stares in the diner and sudden, deliberate distance from lifelong friends. The social cost of curiosity in Oakhaven was immediate and severe, effectively quarantining anyone who threatened to disrupt the town's fragile, unspoken equilibrium. This suffocating social pressure ensured that the few dissenting voices were quickly drowned out by the rustling pines and the persistent roar of the lumber mills. When examining the historical timeline, a distinct pattern emerges, linking the vanishings of David Miller in 1958, Emily Stone in 1965, and Mark Peterson in 1979. Beyond the chronological spacing, each individual disappeared during the transitional weeks of late autumn, precisely when the dense Pacific Northwest fog begins to blanket the valley floor. Law enforcement records from all 3 decades note that personal belongings, vehicles, and even uncashed paychecks were left completely undisturbed at their respective residences. There were no signs of forced entry, no financial anomalies indicating a planned departure, and no subsequent sightings in neighboring counties. Furthermore, Miller, Stone, and Peterson all resided on the extreme geographical periphery of Oakhaven, occupying isolated properties that bordered the dense, unmapped tracts of the national forest. They were effectively swallowed by the environment without a single physical struggle, leaving behind pristine homes that felt more like sudden museums than crime scenes. The geographical isolation of their homes provided the perfect unseen stage for an extraction that left absolutely no forensic trace. The absolute lack of resolution forged a unique brand of generational trauma that permeated Oakhaven's family lines. Parents who had lived through the disappearances of the 50s and 60s raised their children with an inherited, hyper-vigilant anxiety. Curfews were strictly enforced not out of standard parental discipline, but from a deeply ingrained terror that the woods could arbitrarily claim another life. This pervasive dread fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the community, teaching successive generations to view their own hometown as a dormant predator. Children grew up absorbing the unspoken rule that certain roads were never to be traveled after dusk, and that asking about the empty houses on the edge of town was strictly forbidden. The trauma became a silent inheritance, a shadow over the town that dictated behavior and relationships long after the original case files had gathered dust. This inherited anxiety transformed the town's youth into reluctant custodians of a dark, unspoken legacy. In the absence of definitive police answers, the community naturally filled the evidentiary void with rumor and localized folklore. Whispers circulated through the local taverns and church basements, attributing the vanishings to everything from rogue logging syndicates silencing whistleblowers to more esoteric, unsettling forces lurking in the ancient timber. These narratives, while heavily embellished by time and fear, served a vital psychological function for the residents. They provided a structured narrative to contain the terror of the unknown. Yet seasoned investigators understand that within the architecture of small-town folklore, there almost always lies a crucial kernel of truth. The persistent rumors regarding clandestine meetings near the old logging roads or unmarked vehicles seen idling near the victims' properties just prior to their disappearances were consistently dismissed by authorities as hysteria, but they represented the collective subconscious observations of a community that saw more than it dared to officially report. The folklore ultimately acted as a distorted mirror, reflecting the genuine underlying mechanics of a town adept at burying its own sins. Living within this ecosystem of secrets bred a chronic, inescapable sensation of being constantly observed. In an insular community where the population hovered just under 3,000, anonymity was an absolute impossibility. Neighbors tracked the comings and goings of vehicles, noted who lingered too long at the local archives, and observed who spoke to the occasional visiting state trooper. This informal surveillance network was not necessarily malicious in its origin, but it functioned as a highly effective enforcement mechanism for the town's code of silence. If a resident began to dig too deeply into the historical anomalies surrounding Miller, Stone, or Peterson, the entire town would subtly shift its posture toward them. The collective gaze of Oakhaven served as a silent warning system, ensuring that anyone stepping out of line felt the immediate chilling weight of 1,000 watchful eyes. This invisible network effectively neutralized potential whistleblowers before an official statement could ever be recorded. The remarkable longevity of Oakhaven's buried truths was not the result of a single conspiracy, but rather the perfect convergence of environmental and sociological factors. The severe geographical isolation of the Pacific Northwest naturally insulated the town from external scrutiny, keeping federal investigators and national media at a formidable distance. This physical remoteness incubated a fierce, self-reliant culture that viewed outside intervention with deep suspicion, preferring to handle internal anomalies without state interference. Compounding this isolation was the economic stranglehold of the local industries, which demanded absolute loyalty and discretion from their workforce. When combined with the psychological paralyzation induced by the unexplained vanishings, the community essentially locked itself from the inside. Fear, economic dependency, and geographical obscurity formed an impenetrable triad, creating an environment where a secret could easily survive across multiple generations without ever seeing the light of a courtroom. The town became a fortress of its own making, successfully guarding a terrifying void at the center of its history. The human mind possesses a fundamental inability to tolerate a true mystery, instinctively craving an explanation even when the truth is horrifying. A confirmed crime, no matter how brutal, offers a definitive conclusion, a perpetrator, and a mechanism of closure that allows a community to eventually heal. But the utter lack of resolution in Oakhaven denied its residents that psychological release, leaving them suspended in a permanent state of ambiguous grief. When the final volunteer search party of 70 men returned empty-handed from the freezing elevations of Blackwood Ridge in the brutal winter of 1961, the remaining residents of Oakhaven realized that an absolute void of answers was far more terrifying than any horrific truth. The human mind naturally craves a definitive resolution, but the entirely unexplained nature of these sudden vanishings defied all forensic logic and investigative procedure, leaving a massive blank space in the historical record that slowly consumed the isolated timber community from the inside out. The long evening shadows stretching across the increasingly empty municipal town square became blank canvases for the collective imagination. In this environment, the total lack of physical evidence, such as torn clothing or abandoned vehicles, forced the remaining residents to project their deepest anxieties onto the silent, decaying storefronts of Main Street, transforming places like the Miller Hardware Company and the Old Colonial Theater into monuments of localized dread. The complex architecture of this localized dread was not built overnight, but rather constructed steadily and methodically from the initial logging camp incidents of 1958 straight through the economic decline of the early 1980s. During these defining 2.5 decades, the Oakhaven community experienced an anomalous cluster of 42 documented disappearances that fundamentally altered the town's socio-economic trajectory and permanently erased entire multi-generational family lines without leaving behind a single trace of biological evidence. Preserved law enforcement records from the Oakhaven County Sheriff Office during this era document a remarkably consistent methodology of failure. The archives show how initial missing persons reports consistently generated rapid, intensive search operations involving state police bloodhounds and aerial surveillance, only to inexplicably dissolve into completely stagnant cold cases within a matter of 3 to 4 weeks, usually citing a lack of actionable leads or hostile weather conditions. This persistent and highly predictable erosion of investigative momentum meant that an entire generation of Oakhaven residents matured under a terrifying daily assumption. Children born in the 1960s grew up believing that crossing the wrong physical threshold, whether it was the dense timberline behind the regional high school or the crumbling asphalt of County Road 9, meant stepping permanently out of existence without any hope of state or federal rescue. For the devastated families left behind in the wake of these events, the total absence of definitive answers cultivated a unique, enduring form of psychological torment known to clinicians as ambiguous loss. These relatives endured decades of waiting by silent rotary telephones, clutching at the mathematically minuscule hope that a sudden knock at the front porch door might miraculously reverse the waking nightmare and bring their missing loved ones back from the absolute void of the Pacific Northwest wilderness. That persistent, hollow ache gradually consumed their fundamental daily routines, transforming otherwise normal suburban homes into static, suffocating shrines. Inside these houses, untouched bedrooms gathered thick layers of dust. Calendars remained permanently flipped to the exact month of the disappearance, and the relentless, unstoppable passage of time only served to sharpen the agonizing pain of the unresolved mystery as parents watched the friends of their missing children grow up and move away. This highly specific brand of grief remained permanently suspended in the very atmosphere of the town, acting as a suffocating emotional weight that prevented any genuine mourning or forward psychological movement. Because the state of Washington required a body to issue an immediate death certificate, those left behind were legally and spiritually tethered to the missing, unable to hold traditional funerals, close bank accounts, or properly lay their profound trauma to rest. The vast, imposing geography of the Pacific Northwest naturally provided an absolutely ideal mechanism for this sustained ambiguity to thrive. Oakhaven was completely encircled by more than 300,000 acres of dense, ancient Douglas fir forests and rugged alpine terrain in the lower Cascade foothills, creating a hostile geographical barrier that naturally swallowed sunlight, muffled acoustic sound waves, and easily consumed fragile human life without leaving a single disturbance on the forest floor. Deeply hidden limestone cave systems and completely unmapped geological ravines cut violently through the surrounding wilderness, dropping hundreds of feet into the bedrock. These treacherous topographical features created tens of thousands of natural subterranean vaults, where forensic evidence, hiking equipment, and human remains could easily be concealed forever beneath incredibly heavy layers of wet, accumulating sphagnum moss and massive piles of decaying fallen timber. Professional search and rescue parties frequently encountered completely impenetrable walls of thorny undergrowth and sudden, treacherous vertical drop-offs that rendered standard grid search protocols and compass navigation entirely ineffective. These extreme environmental hazards routinely forced exhausted volunteers and trained state troopers to completely abandon vast, unsearched tracts of the wilderness, leaving massive blind spots in the official search radius where missing individuals could have easily been located. Far beyond the physical barriers of the forest, a profound and deeply toxic psychological burden settled over the remaining community as the 1970s bled into the 1980s. A terrifying collective awareness slowly took root among the citizens, manifesting as an unspoken but universally acknowledged understanding that certain powerful elements within the town, perhaps the local logging syndicate or the municipal government itself, were actively suppressing the horrific truth of what was actually happening out in the deep timberline. Living day after day in an isolated space where every single person harbors the exact same dark suspicion, yet absolutely no one dares to articulate it out loud, fundamentally fractures the very foundation of basic human trust. Longtime neighbors began looking at one another with highly guarded eyes across grocery store aisles and church pews, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming fear that breaking the strict town silence would somehow invite the exact same invisible, devastating fate upon their own vulnerable households. Routine conversations in prominent public spaces, from the post office lobby to the elementary school drop-off zones, were carefully calibrated and strictly stripped of any passing reference to the dozens of missing individuals. Instead, residents focused obsessively on trivial local weather patterns and regional sports scores, ensuring that a highly fragile, entirely artificial facade of everyday normalcy was aggressively maintained at all possible costs. Despite this incredibly oppressive and paranoid psychological environment, a highly distinct demographic pattern emerged among the specific individuals who stubbornly chose not to flee to larger cities like Seattle or Portland. Their steadfast decision to remain in the dying town of Oakhaven was fundamentally tied to deep, inescapable generational roots and incredibly rigid family caretaking obligations that somehow managed to heavily outweigh their most basic, primal human instinct for immediate self-preservation. These holdouts were firmly anchored by multiple generations of inherited, unsellable agricultural land and slowly failing local businesses, like the third-generation lumber mill and the independent auto repair shop. They found themselves completely trapped by a profound, almost pathological sense of civic duty that practically forced them to silently endure the steadily encroaching darkness of the region, rather than cowardly abandon their hard-fought ancestral legacy to the wilderness. Their enduring, tragic presence was highly visible in the deeply weathered, exhausted faces standing behind the Formica counters of the Oak Tree Diner and the Main Street Pharmacy. These stubborn business owners effectively acted as the silent, unofficial sentinels of the valley, helplessly watching the slow, agonizing economic and social decay of their own beloved community as the population dwindled with every passing decade and every new, unsolved disappearance. Ultimately, remaining in the cursed boundaries of Oakhaven required a terrible, soul-crushing compromise, gradually inducing the deeply unsettling sensation of becoming a complete stranger within the walls of one's own home. The pervasive, heavy silence of the town and the incredibly rigid, unspoken social rules regarding the missing effectively established an impenetrable, invisible psychological barrier between the remaining traumatized residents and the horrifying, unacknowledged reality they were permanently forced to inhabit. Living in Oakhaven eventually meant accepting a pervasive, suffocating silence that transformed lifelong residents into wary strangers. The unspoken rules of the community dictated that certain questions were simply never asked, creating an invisible barrier between neighbors who had shared fence lines for generations. Walking down Main Street became an exercise in careful avoidance, where a prolonged glance or a sudden pause in conversation felt like a dangerous breach of protocol. The town had cultivated an environment where isolation was the only guaranteed form of safety. That profound alienation settled over the fog-drenched streets like a heavy frost, ensuring that any anomalous activity was deliberately ignored by eyes trained to look away. The architecture of this collective silence fundamentally traces back to the winter of 1958, a year that permanently fractured the town's idyllic facade. David Miller, a prominent local merchant with deep roots in the community, simply ceased to exist between his storefront and his home less than a mile away. His disappearance lacked any discernible logic, leaving behind no physical evidence, no financial irregularities, and no plausible motive for a voluntary departure. Law enforcement treated the incident as a tragic anomaly, a singular event to be filed away and quietly forgotten by the local press. Yet the absolute void left by Miller established a grim precedent for Oakhaven, introducing the terrifying concept that a person could be swallowed whole by the very landscape they called home. This was the initial structural failure in the town's psychological dam, the moment the community first realized that their quiet isolation did not equate to immunity. The void left by the events of 1958 quickly necessitated a coping mechanism, leading the community to actively construct a barrier of willful ignorance. To maintain any semblance of normalcy, the residents of Oakhaven weaponized collective denial. By refusing to acknowledge the profound implications of a man vanishing without a trace, the townspeople could artificially sustain the illusion of a secure, predictable existence. This mechanism of survival required a unified, unspoken agreement to label the inexplicable as merely unfortunate, effectively shutting down any rigorous inquiry before it could begin. This psychological fortress allowed daily life to proceed uninterrupted, with businesses opening on time and church pews filling every Sunday. However, the cost of this manufactured tranquility was a deep, corrosive anxiety that permeated every household. The denial did not erase the threat, it merely forced the fear underground, where it festered in the quiet moments behind locked doors and drawn curtains. This desperate grip on a fabricated reality ultimately isolated the community even further, leaving them entirely unprepared when the pattern inevitably re-emerged. Exactly 7 years later, in the autumn of 1965, the fragile equilibrium shattered with the disappearance of Emily Stone. A young schoolteacher known for her meticulous routines, Stone vanished during a brief walk along the perimeter of the dense, old-growth timber bordering the municipal park. The circumstances were chillingly identical to the previous case: an abrupt cessation of presence, an absolute lack of forensic material, and a profound silence from the surrounding environment. The loss of Emily Stone fundamentally altered the town's internal calculus. It proved that the anomaly of 1958 was not an isolated tragedy, but the initiation of a terrifying sequence. The repetition of such an inexplicable event forced the residents to recognize a predatory rhythm operating within their borders, intensifying the latent unease into a palpable, constant dread that dictated every movement. The realization that the dark woods had claimed another life effectively extinguished the town's remaining innocence, cementing a legacy of perpetual suspicion. Oakhaven was now burdened with an emotional weight that fundamentally altered its identity, transforming a quiet logging community into a geographical trap. The legacy of these unresolved events created a permanent undercurrent of tension, a collective understanding that the past was not a closed chapter, but an active, dormant threat. Every rusted missing person flyer that clung to a utility pole served as a physical manifestation of this enduring trauma. Generations grew up inheriting this atmospheric anxiety, internalizing the danger without ever being explicitly taught its parameters. The town's history became a ghost story lacking an ending, forcing every resident to navigate their daily lives with the subconscious knowledge that the ground beneath them was inherently unstable. They were bound together not by community spirit, but by a shared, suffocating proximity to the unknown. This inherited psychological burden mandated a strict adherence to routine, turning mundane activities into calculated exercises in risk management. The true permanence of this threat was unequivocally confirmed in 1979 with the vanishing of Mark Peterson. A seasoned outdoorsman and local mechanic, Peterson was intimately familiar with the treacherous topography of the surrounding county, making his sudden disappearance on a routine hunting trip entirely counterintuitive. Search and rescue teams scoured the rugged terrain for weeks, utilizing dogs and aerial surveillance, only to encounter the same impenetrable void that had consumed the others. Peterson's case definitively dismantled any lingering theories of accidental exposure or voluntary flight. It demonstrated with brutal clarity that the phenomenon plaguing Oakhaven was not a fleeting crisis confined to a previous era, but a permanent, localized fixture. The vanishing of a man so capable of surviving the wilderness proved that the danger was not the landscape itself, but something fundamentally anomalous operating within it. The failure of extensive search operations in 1979 solidified the community's belief that external intervention was entirely futile. Protecting the horrifying reality of these recurring losses exacted a devastating human toll on those left behind. The absolute necessity to maintain the town's facade of normalcy meant that the profound grief of the victims' families was systematically ignored, treated as an uncomfortable disruption rather than a shared tragedy. The desperate need to maintain the town's pristine facade meant that the agonizing grief of the victims' families was systematically ignored and ruthlessly suppressed throughout the late 1970s. Neighbors literally crossed the rain-slicked pavement of Main Street to avoid grieving mothers outside Miller's grocery, treating their profound sorrow not as a shared community tragedy, but as a dangerous contagion that threatened the collective, fragile delusion of safety. A 1981 county health ledger recovered from the basement of the Oakhaven Memorial Clinic noted a 400% anomalous spike in heavy sedatives prescribed specifically to the immediate relatives of the missing. This sterile medical documentation captured a quiet, heavily medicated despair that unfolded entirely behind drawn curtains and locked front doors along Elm Street. This enforced isolation did not exist in a total vacuum, as the deep economic interconnectedness of Pacific Northwest logging communities meant that dark rumors inevitably traversed county lines along the winding stretches of Highway 101. Supply trucks and heavy timber haulers acted as a rudimentary communication network, carrying whispered fragments of Oakhaven's sinister reputation outward to neighboring valleys and distant fog-shrouded mill towns up the coast. Yet this regional proximity fundamentally hindered formal investigations by state authorities, just as much as it spread the terrifying local folklore. A shared, fiercely rugged independence defined these interconnected timber towns, fostering a profound multi-generational distrust of outside law enforcement that ensured local secrets remained securely locked within the broader geographic network of logging camps and rural outposts. State police dispatch logs preserved from 1983 reveal that urgent requests for mutual aid between these neighboring jurisdictions were frequently met with deliberate, calculated delays and mysteriously lost paperwork. Crucial backup units from the Cascade County Sheriff's Department often took up to 72 hours to respond to basic inquiries regarding vehicles abandoned near the Oakhaven border. For the handful of individuals within Oakhaven who explicitly knew or strongly suspected the horrifying truth, this toxic environment forced a brutal, daily internal struggle of conscience. The grim reality of walking past the darkened, empty homes of the vanished on the way to the post office required a deliberate, exhausting mental compartmentalization just to avoid confronting their own passive complicity. These residents faced an immense, paralyzing moral dilemma, constantly weighing the profound, sickening guilt of their silence against the immediate, terrifying necessity of protecting their own spouses and children from a similar, sudden fate. To speak up to FBI investigators or local journalists was to directly invite the encroaching darkness to their own front doorsteps. effectively making terrified cowards out of fundamentally decent, hardworking people. This deeply corrosive, unspoken guilt slowly disintegrated the community's spirit from the inside out over the span of a single decade. The vibrant town festivals and neighborhood potlucks that once defined the town were quietly abandoned by 1985, leaving behind a hollow, suspicious shell of neighborly trust where residents began installing heavy deadbolts and 6-foot privacy fences. Surviving long-term in this oppressive environment required a precise, flawless understanding of what staying actually meant within Oakhaven's rigid, unforgiving social architecture. It was never merely about maintaining a physical presence, paying local property taxes, or holding a permanent residential address within the heavily forested town limits along the river. True belonging dictated strict, unwavering adherence to an unspoken code of absolute silence, demanding that residents never publicly question the decisions of the mayor or the sheriff, and willingly accept the sudden, inexplicable voids left by missing neighbors. To stay meant to actively, consciously participate in the collective amnesia, seamlessly closing ranks and changing the subject the moment someone vanished into the tree line. The perpetually empty, vinyl-covered bar stools positioned at the far, shadowed edge of the Timberline Tavern served as subtle, chilling monuments to those who had failed to properly comprehend those survival rules. Patrons deliberately left those specific seats vacant for months at a time, a silent, psychological warning to newcomers about the severe consequences of asking too many questions. Every single time the town establishment successfully erased a dissenting resident, it generated a chilling psychological echo that propagated through the subsequent decades of Oakhaven's history. The completely unresolved nature of the initial 1974 cases established a grim, unshakable precedent, definitively proving to the remaining population that people could simply cease to exist without any resulting justice, media scrutiny, or legal consequence. Each new, sudden disappearance throughout the 1980s reinforced the underlying, paralyzing terror, solidifying the community's grim resolve to look the other way and cementing the bureaucratic machinery of their own subjugation. The bloody past was never truly buried in the local cemetery. It remained an active, predatory force that shaped every mundane interaction at the hardware store and strictly dictated the invisible boundaries of safe public behavior. Archival police incident reports spanning 3 entirely different decades feature the exact same, legally approved boilerplate language, demonstrating exactly how the municipal system efficiently processed each human tragedy into identical, sanitized paperwork. Hundreds of files from the 1970s through the 1990s end abruptly with rubber-stamped phrases claiming the victim left voluntarily and noting 0 signs of a physical struggle. The absolute foundational element of this deliberate, bureaucratic sanitization was the recurring, mandated use of the word unexplained as the official permanent descriptor for every single vanishing. This highly specific legal terminology was never intended as a temporary placeholder for an active, ongoing investigation, but rather served as a deliberate, final classification explicitly designed to legally halt any further forensic inquiry or state-funded search effort. By officially labeling a disappearance as fundamentally anomalous and completely beyond conventional comprehension, local law enforcement successfully absolved themselves of the professional responsibility to actually solve it. The unexplained label acted as a structural, administrative dead end, permanently protecting the town's pristine facade by legally transforming obvious foul play into an unfortunate, supposedly unsolvable mystery that required no search warrants or suspect interrogations. Stamping a manila case file with that single absolving word in red ink was the administrative equivalent of pouring thick, heavy concrete over a shallow, unmarked grave. Once that final classification was applied, the physical folders were permanently banished to the damp, forgotten basement archives of the municipal building, ensuring the victims would never be officially searched for again. Beneath this incredibly heavy, suffocating layer of official municipal denial lay the profound, desperate human need for closure, a fundamental psychological necessity consistently and brutally denied to the shattered families left behind. The absolute, agonizing lack of definitive answers created an open, festering emotional wound in the community, permanently transforming the physical landscape of Oakhaven from its misty riverbanks to its dense pine forests, into one massive, perpetual, and completely unresolved crime scene. The total absence of a recovered body, a signed confession, or even a basic chronological timeline leaves a psychological void that absolutely refuses to heal. For the dozens of families left behind in Oakhaven, the damp mornings still begin with a desperate glance at the front door, half expecting the lost relatives to simply walk back through the threshold. This endless, agonizing waiting transforms standard human grief into a suspended state of psychological torment. A town that offers absolutely no definitive answers forces its exhausted residents to live inside a perpetual, maddening question. The decaying local precinct files from October of 1984 clearly show that initial missing persons reports were routinely filed away in the basement archives before the typewriter ink was even dry. This bureaucratic apathy forced desperate relatives to organize their own independent search parties, leaving untrained civilians to conduct futile, dangerous sweeps through thousands of acres of dense blackberry brambles and treacherous ravines, without any official law enforcement support. The settlement of Oakhaven was originally built deep within the unforgiving embrace of the Pacific Northwest wilderness, nestled at an elevation of 4,000 feet. Towering 200-foot Douglas firs and a relentless annual rainfall of 90 inches heavily shadow the narrow valley, creating a damp, natural fortress that effectively traps the entire town in a state of perpetual twilight. The unpaved logging roads that weave blindly through this steep terrain are remarkably treacherous, designed strictly for rapid timber extraction rather than safe civilian connection. This severe geography strictly dictates the isolated rhythm of daily life, keeping the modern outside world at a distinct and highly deliberate distance. But this suffocating isolation stretches far beyond the physical boundary of the old-growth tree line. The incredibly dense timber canopy above perfectly mirrors a rigid psychological barrier constructed by the wary residents below. Living for generations in such a remote, weather-beaten enclave naturally breeds a fierce, unspoken reliance on immediate neighbors, but it simultaneously cultivates a profound, deeply rooted distrust of any external state authorities or federal investigators. The surrounding forest acts as both a vital provider of economic livelihood and a massive, completely silent vault highly capable of permanently swallowing absolutely anything dragged into its shadowy depths. Several decades later, during a sparsely attended municipal meeting in November of 2004, the Oakhaven Town Council quietly passed a highly specific zoning ordinance. This unprecedented legal measure permanently restricted any future commercial or residential development across nearly 3,000 acres bordering the old eastern logging tracts, effectively sealing off the exact geographic sector where the highest concentration of missing persons cases originally occurred. The official bureaucratic reasoning recorded in the municipal ledger cited severe soil erosion and dangerous geological instability along the steep ridges. However, the universally understood but entirely unspoken truth among the remaining locals was a collective, terrified refusal to ever again disturb the damp ground where so many final, frantic footprints simply vanished into the moss without leading to a single recovered piece of clothing or bone. The younger generations born in Oakhaven, long after the initial terrifying wave of 1980s disappearances, ultimately inherited a profound, strictly enforced, and entirely unspoken community curfew. Long before the streetlights flicker on at dusk, the local playgrounds and dirt roads completely empty out, driven by an inherited generational trauma that firmly dictates no child should ever linger near the edge of the woods when the afternoon shadows begin to lengthen. Even the most rebellious teenagers living in Oakhaven simply do not venture into the dense woods after dusk under any circumstances. They have been thoroughly conditioned since infancy by their parents' lingering, unspoken terror to view the dark tree line not as an inviting piece of raw nature, but as an absolute boundary of basic physical survival. Crossing that specific threshold after sunset is universally understood as an open invitation to join the permanent ranks of the eternally missing. By October of 1998, the mounting pressure finally forced the state police department to entirely alter their established regional response protocols for any missing adults reported within these rural timber communities. Instead of waiting the standard 48 hours to initiate a formal search, dispatchers implemented a highly aggressive new policy that immediately mobilized tracking dogs, helicopter units, and specialized forensic teams the very moment a resident failed to return from a scheduled shift at the mill. The staggering sheer volume of unresolved cold cases originating exclusively from this single, isolated valley forced seasoned investigators to completely discard the standard law enforcement assumption of voluntary flight. Detectives were now mandated to treat absolutely every sudden, unexplained absence in these remote logging towns as a highly probable, violent criminal act from hour one, fundamentally shifting the investigative burden from casual search and rescue to immediate homicide protocol. Yet, despite this massive influx of state resources and rapid deployment strategies, the single most glaring anomaly remains the absolute, utter lack of physical evidence ever recovered by highly trained modern search and rescue teams. Even with dozens of trained tracking hounds sweeping the exact last known locations within hours of a disappearance, investigators consistently fail to discover a single dropped keychain, a torn scrap of denim, or even a microscopic drop of blood on the forest floor. Despite massive recent advancements in high-resolution thermal imaging and sophisticated aerial drone surveillance frequently deployed over the mountainous region, the results remain entirely non-existent. The exact mechanical method of how so many heavy, fully grown individuals were rapidly removed from the environment without leaving a single trace of physical struggle, dragged footprints, or motorized transport completely defies all standard forensic logic taught in modern criminal justice academies. The massive local timber mill, which once proudly stood as the undisputed economic beating heart of the entire county by employing over 400 union workers, eventually suffered a severe and entirely permanent labor shortage. As the terrifying local legends slowly transformed into documented statistical facts, the facility found it fundamentally impossible to maintain a functional night shift, drastically reducing their annual production capacity and crippling the municipal tax base. Qualified outsiders flatly refused to relocate their families to Oakhaven, even when the desperate mill ownership began offering exceptionally high-paying salaries and generous relocation bonuses. Potential applicants were reading the grim, widely published regional crime statistics and quickly deciding that the lucrative hazard pay was simply not worth the terrifying risk of becoming yet another completely unexplained permanent entry on the rapidly expanding county missing persons ledger. For the rapidly aging parents who still meticulously maintain the perfectly preserved empty bedrooms of the long-missing victims, the persistent lack of an official state-issued death certificate creates an absolutely agonizing state of legal and financial limbo. Without a recovered body to definitively prove a fatality, these devastated families remain firmly trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare, unable to move forward with basic estate planning or emotional closure. Because the state legally considers the missing to be merely absent, complex family estates absolutely cannot be settled through standard probate court, and massive life insurance policies remain permanently frozen in corporate trust accounts. Consequently, the exhausted surviving relatives are legally forced to continue paying thousands of dollars in annual property taxes on rural homes jointly owned by literal ghosts, who the state government stubbornly refuses to officially declare deceased. The frustrated state legislature finally intervened during the spring session of 2012, drafting a highly specialized legal provision specifically designed for these remote, heavily forested jurisdictions. This unprecedented new statute formally expedited the legal presumption of death, allowing local probate judges to finally issue binding death certificates in specific cases involving prolonged, unexplainable absences that had remained completely devoid of physical evidence for more than 7 consecutive years. This sterile, bureaucratic adjustment certainly provided a cold, strictly paper-based resolution for the overwhelmed county courts and frustrated financial institutions, but it accomplished absolutely nothing on a human level. A signed legal document could never silence the terrified, enduring whispers that still echo through the perpetually damp, deeply shadowed streets of Oakhaven every single time the thick evening fog inevitably rolls back in from the silent, watching forest. Even with modern ground-penetrating radar and exhaustive grid searches, the most fundamental question surrounding the Oakhaven vanishings remains completely unanswered. Investigators cannot explain why a specific 3-mile stretch of dense timberline, unofficially dubbed the Oakhaven Corridor, completely swallowed all physical trace of the missing individuals. This geographical anomaly defies standard search and rescue logic, leaving a void where forensic evidence should logically exist. The total absence of clothing fragments, personal effects, or skeletal remains within this highly targeted zone suggests a mechanism of concealment that goes far beyond accidental loss in the wilderness. It implies a systematic effort to erase these individuals from the physical record, an operation that required deep knowledge of the terrain and an unsettling level of precision. The archives offer no precedent for such absolute environmental erasure, leaving current detectives to grapple with a ghost map of coordinates that yield nothing but soil and silence. The enduring mystery fundamentally altered how regional law enforcement operates, resulting in a mandatory policy shift across the entire county. Known today in regional police academies as the Oakhaven Protocol, the mandate requires an immediate multi-agency tactical deployment the moment a resident is reported missing within the town limits, bypassing the standard 24-hour waiting period entirely. This rapid escalation strategy is a direct, institutional admission that the local landscape holds a unique, predatory threat that conventional policing failed to recognize decades ago. As a direct result of this procedural overhaul, the perimeter of the town is now monitored by a sophisticated network of thermal imaging cameras and license plate readers funded by state grants specifically designated for high-risk rural zones. The infrastructure of Oakhaven has been permanently transformed from a quiet logging community into a heavily surveilled containment area. Every vehicle entering or exiting the valley is recorded, creating a perpetual digital ledger designed to prevent the historical pattern of untraceable departures from ever repeating. Beneath the hum of the new surveillance network, the human cost manifests in the quiet, enduring rituals of the families left behind. Many descendants of the vanished have developed a psychological condition local therapists identify as a localized form of complex grief, characterized by the preservation of the missing individuals' homes exactly as they were left. Entire properties on the edge of town sit frozen in time, meticulously maintained by aging relatives who are trapped between the logical acceptance of loss and the agonizing infinitesimal possibility of a return. The families left behind in Oakhaven did not simply move on when the official search efforts concluded. Instead, they adapted to a profound and enduring isolation, forced to navigate a daily reality where their missing relatives were simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. The concrete consequence of these unresolved vanishings manifests clearly in the county probate records, where dozens of estates remain frozen in legal purgatory for decades. Without a recovered body, a formal death certificate cannot be issued, trapping the surviving relatives financially and emotionally at the exact moment their loved ones stepped off the map. Beyond the immediate families, the aftershock of these events fundamentally altered how the broader region interacts with the physical geography of Oakhaven. The surrounding dense timberlands are no longer viewed as a natural resource or a recreational sanctuary, but rather as a hostile perimeter. State mapping agencies quietly stopped updating the public trail guides for the eastern ridge, allowing the once popular logging roads to become completely overgrown and reclaimed by the forest. This shift reflects a permanent change in the local assumption of safety, leaving behind a physical environment that the remaining population actively avoids, treating the woods not as nature, but as an expansive, silent vault that simply swallowed its own evidence. Behind the clouded glass of the municipal bulletin board, a single, sun-bleached flyer continues to curl at the edges, the printed face long faded into a pale, featureless silhouette. It remains pinned to the cork, not as an active plea for a safe return, but as a quiet, enduring monument to the unresolved. The residents of Oakhaven walk past that clouded glass every single day, carrying the weight of the unanswered, forever living alongside the silent, unyielding tree line that knows exactly what it took. Every small town has a story they'd rather forget. New case every week. Hit the bell so you don't miss it. Every small town has a story they'd rather forget. Subscribe to Buried in Plain Sight. Small town crimes. We make sure they can't. New case every week. Hit the bell so you don't miss it.